Amy Coney Barrett, she's really made waves, hasn't she? In American law, I mean.
Yeah, she's definitely a major figure.
And you brought in some super interesting sources about her, so we can, really dive into, her whole story and what her decisions on the court could mean.
Yeah.
That's kind of crazy to think about, right? Like, she could be on the Supreme Court for decades.
It is.
Decades.
Yeah, what's really interesting is how fast her rise was
Right.
to this position. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, like a rocket.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
From respected law professor to Supreme Court justice, it happened so fast.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit, go back to the beginning. Our sources talk about her early life, growing up in New Orleans, born in 72, raised in a really Catholic family. It seems like faith and tradition were super important.
Yeah, for sure. And that background, you can really see it in her legal philosophy. It's actually pretty fascinating how her religious views and her judicial views, they seem to really intertwine, especially when you look at how she approaches interpreting the Constitution. That whole originalist approach.
Right. Originalism. Okay, so originalism.
Yeah.
I mean, on the surface, it sounds kind of straightforward, right?
Yeah.
Just interpret the Constitution the way the Founding Fathers intended. But I feel like there's got to be more to it than that.
Oh, definitely. There's definitely more to it. Originalism is, it's complicated.
Yeah.
There are so many different schools of thought, even within originalism. People who say they're originalists, they often disagree on how to actually use it, in real life cases. It's kind of like if you were restoring a vintage car. You want to stay true to the original design, but you also have to make sure it can still run, in today's world.
I love that analogy. That's a good one. So, okay, so how does Barrett's brand of originalism, how does that actually play out in her decisions?
Yeah.
Because our sources point to some pretty major cases, and I think this is where it gets real for our listeners.
Yeah.
These decisions, they're actually impacting American life right now.
Absolutely. And I think we should probably start with the biggest one. Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. That's the case that overturned Roe v. Wade.
Right.
I mean, talk about a seismic shift in American law, ending the constitutional right to abortion after, almost 50 years?
Huge.
Yeah.
It sparked so many debates, protests, all across the country. And it seems like that's kind of a theme with her decisions.
Yeah.
They tend to, make a really big impact.
Yeah, that's true. And I think part of that is because she's willing to reinterpret existing laws, based on this originalist framework that she uses. She's not afraid to challenge precedents that have been around for a long time. Her argument is those precedents might need to be looked at again based on, what the framers of the Constitution actually meant.
Right.
Even if, society's values have changed since then.
So we're seeing how that originalist lens, it really shapes how she approaches these massive cases. But what else? Because our sources mention other big decisions, too.
Yeah.
Decisions that are, reshaping American law.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one that stands out is Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard. That's the one that got rid of affirmative action in college admissions. So now, that could potentially affect diversity on campuses all over the country.
Wow.
It's a ruling with, huge consequences. It brings up some really important questions, about the role of race and equality in higher education.
It's a lot to think about, especially, if you have kids who are, getting close to college age.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there's also West Virginia v. EPA, and that one's all about the environment, right?
Right, yeah. That case limited the EPA's power to regulate greenhouse gases, which, of course, has a major impact on climate change policy.
Right.
Some people were really happy about that decision, the ones who, want less government regulation, but then others saw it as, a big step backward in the fight against climate change.
Okay, so we're starting to see a pattern here, right? These aren't little tiny changes.
No.
These decisions are fundamentally changing things.
Yeah.
The legal landscape in America.
And that's what makes the long-term implications so important. Barrett's still relatively young. And if she stays on the court for decades, like we were saying,
right,
her influence could shape American law for generations to come.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, what will the world even look like in 20 or 30 years?
Yeah.
And how will her decisions be playing out then?
It really is. It's a fascinating question. And it's one that legal experts are already trying to figure out. They're looking at voting rights, LGBTQ plus rights, even privacy rights, all these areas where the existing precedents, could be challenged, maybe even overturned.
So it's not just about these specific cases.
Right.
It's about a bigger shift, right,
Yeah.
in the balance of power, like rethinking what the Supreme Court's role even is in our society.
Exactly. You're exactly right. And that's what's causing so much discussion and debate right now. And it's interesting, too, because her decisions, they seem to be part of this, like, larger trend. Like, the court is becoming more willing to tackle these really controversial, hot-button issues, you know?
You know, one thing that really jumped out at me from the sources was about her religious beliefs. Like, she belongs to this group called People of Praise.
Right.
I got to admit, I'd never even heard of it before.
Yeah.
It's a Christian group, I guess what you'd call charismatic Christian. And they're known for, like, really emphasizing community and traditional gender roles.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique group. And it's made a lot of people wonder, you know, how her faith might affect her decisions as a justice.
Yeah, it's that whole question of, like, how much do personal beliefs play a role?
Right.
You know, when a judge is interpreting the law. I mean, it's a debate that's been going on forever, but it feels especially relevant now with Barrett because her faith is so central to her life.
It's a really complex issue. I mean, legal scholars are always trying to figure it out. Barrett herself has said that, you know, her personal beliefs don't control her rulings, that she's committed to upholding the law no matter what her own views are.
Right.
But of course, her critics say that's, like, impossible.
Yeah.
To completely separate, you know, your worldview from how you interpret the law.
Yeah. So it's this constant tension, right, between being objective and subjective. Like, how do we make sure that judges are being faithful to the law, but also, like, responsive to how society's changing?
Right.
It's a tough balancing act.
It is. It's really delicate. And honestly, I think it's a conversation we need to keep having as a society. We need judges who are willing to explain their thinking, you know, like how they got to their decisions, and to really engage with people who, you know, maybe see things differently.
Yeah, transparency and open-mindedness, those seem really, really key, especially when you're talking about decisions that affect people's lives in such a big way. Speaking of which, let's go back to originalism for a minute. You mentioned before that it's a lot more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
Exactly. It's not as simple as, you know, just opening up an old textbook and being like, okay, this is what the founding fathers meant. Like, there are all these different schools of thought. And even people who say they're originalists, you know, they don't always agree on how to put it into practice.
Right.
In the real world.
Could you give us, like, an example of how Barrett's version of originalism, like, plays out?
Sure. Let's look at the Dobbs case again, the one about Roe v. Wade. Barrett and the other justices who agreed with her, they argued that the right to abortion, it's not actually written down in the Constitution, and that it's not, like, deeply rooted in American history or tradition. So basically their argument was, because the framers didn't specifically talk about abortion, it wasn't a right that the court should protect.
But, I mean, the world's changed so much since the 1700s.
Right.
It's hard to even imagine the framers, like, thinking about the things we deal with today.
Exactly.
You know, reproductive technology, the internet, all of that.
Right. And that's what a lot of legal scholars say is wrong with originalism. Like, you can't just take 18th century values and apply them to 21st century problems. It's just not, like, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's like trying to fit, you know, like a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah, exactly. A perfect analogy.
So where does that leave us? Are we just, like, stuck trying to make the past and the present fit together?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, it's something that we as a society, we really have to grapple with. But I do think it's super important to have these conversations, to understand, like, everyone's point of view, and to try to create a legal system that, you know, it's based on principles, but it can also adapt to the challenges that we're facing today.
That sounds like a tall order.
Oh, it definitely is. But I think that's what's so great about, you know, doing a deep dive like this. It's not about, like, finding all the answers. It's about getting people thinking, you know, asking those tough questions. And then hopefully, you know, maybe they'll go off and do some more digging on their own and form their own opinions.
Yeah, that's great. And speaking of digging deeper, our sources also talk about how quickly her confirmation process happened.
Right.
It was so fast.
Yeah.
Especially compared to, like, the whole Merrick Garland situation back in 2016.
Oh, yeah. It was a night and day difference. And it really shows you how, you know, how partisan Supreme Court appointments have become. Barrett's confirmation was just like a whirlwind. It tells you a lot about the political atmosphere at the time and how much was at stake.
Like, the court itself has become like a political battleground.
Yeah.
With each side trying to like gain control.
It is a bit worrying, that trend. It does
Yeah.
make you wonder about the integrity of the judiciary
Right.
and its independence. I think it's really important for us, for all of us, to talk about this, and to fight for a system that's fair and impartial, that's truly serving justice.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot, right? We've talked about her legal philosophy, her background, the whole political context of her appointment, and the impact that her decisions could have, down the line. But there's one question that keeps coming back to me. Like, who is she? Beyond the headlines and the legal jargon.
That's a great question. And honestly, it's not an easy one to answer. She's a very complex person. There's like a lot to her story.
Yeah. Our sources mention how influential her mentors were, especially Antonin Scalia.
Right.
The like giant of conservative legal thought. She clicked for him early on in her career. What do you think? How much of an impact did he have on her?
Oh, Scalia's influence on her is huge, no question. I mean, he was all about originalism, and she obviously took that on as like her own approach. But I think his influence goes deeper than just like specific legal ideas. Scalia was really, really good at like rhetoric and argument. And I think she learned from him, how to write really persuasive opinions, opinions that really push forward, her legal vision.
So she's like carrying on his legacy in a way.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. And it reminds us that the court, it's not like this static thing. It's always changing. As new justices come in, they bring their own points of view, their own experiences, and that changes things.
And in Barrett's case, those perspectives are like really rooted in her faith, her conservative background, and of course her commitment to originalism. It's a pretty powerful combination, and it's bound to have a lasting impact on American law.
But it also brings up some big questions, doesn't it, about the future of the court and what role it should have in our democracy.
Definitely. It does. And those are questions that, we as a society, we need to be thinking about. We need to be having these open, honest conversations about what the judiciary's role is, the balance of power, the values that we want our legal system to reflect, all of that. As we've been talking, I keep going back to something you said earlier, this idea that her decisions could shape the legal landscape for generations.
Yeah.
It's kind of a heavy thought.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder, like, what kind of world are we moving towards?
It really is thought-provoking. And it shows how important it is to understand, like, her whole approach to the law, her jurisprudence. What are the potential consequences of her decisions? We have to think about those things.
Because those decisions, they're not just like abstract legal theories. Right?
Well, not at all.
They have real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. We're talking about things like access to health care, education, the future of our planet, the very foundation of our society. It's all connected.
It's a lot to take in. And it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by it all, to be honest.
I get it.
But I think that's why deep dives like this are so crucial.
Totally.
They help us break these complicated issues down, into smaller pieces, look at them from different angles, and hopefully that makes us feel a little bit more empowered to, like, have these conversations and talk about the future we want to build.
I agree. I think that's a great point. And that kind of leads us to another important question, right? What does the future hold? Like, what might a future Supreme Court case look like? How might Barrett's perspective, her unique way of looking at things, how might that shape the outcome? It's like we're trying to look into a legal crystal ball or something.
Oh, I love that. A legal crystal ball. So what's your crystal ball telling you? Are there any areas of law that seem especially, like, vulnerable, given her originalist approach, I mean?
Well, I can't say for sure, of course, but yeah, there are definitely some areas of law that, could be more susceptible to that originalist lens she uses, like, for example, the right to privacy.
Oh, wow.
That's not something that's like directly spelled out in the Constitution,
Right.
So that could be, that could face some serious challenges.
Privacy rights. Wow, that's a big one. I mean, that covers so much stuff, right? Like everything from like our digital footprint to, choices we make about our own bodies and families.
Exactly. And if the court starts to interpret privacy more narrowly, well, that could have a ripple effect all over the place. It could impact everything from, how companies collect data online to access to reproductive health care, like one domino falling and knocking down a whole bunch of others.
It's not just about like individual cases then. It's like it could change the whole legal landscape.
Right.
Like how we think about basic rights, fundamental rights, especially in the digital age.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And that's a debate that's going to get, more and more intense in the next few years. It's pretty fascinating to think about, actually.
Yeah.
A little unsettling, too, maybe, to imagine how her decisions could, shape things legally for, like, generations. Imagine a law student today, someone who's really inspired by Barrett, and now they're, going into this world where those precedents have already been set.
Like she's writing the first draft of, like, a whole new chapter in American law.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what will those cases even look like in the future? What kind of new, like, legal questions are going to come up?
That's the kind of stuff that keeps legal scholars up at night. I mean, think about it. The Founding Fathers, they couldn't have even pictured the internet.
Right.
Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, all this stuff is like completely uncharted territory. And using Barrett's approach, that originalist approach, well, who knows what kind of interpretations we might end up with.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to wrap your head around. But this deep dive has been so helpful. I feel like we've really, like, connected the dots, from her childhood in New Orleans to how she might reshape American law, like, for decades to come. It's a story that's still being written.
It is, and it's a story that, honestly, everyone should be paying attention to, because at the end of the day, these decisions affect all of us.
Yeah.
They shape the society we live in, the rights we have, the future we're building.
As we've been talking, I keep thinking about one thing from the sources. It was an anecdote about when she was a little girl. Apparently, even then, she was known for being really smart and for having, like, really strong convictions. The story goes, she was talking to a classmate once, and the classmate said something about, doubting God's existence. And she said, "You just haven't thought about it hard enough."
Wow. That's a pretty powerful anecdote. It shows her, like, intellectual toughness, her commitment to her beliefs, and, that she's not afraid to engage in those difficult conversations.
It really does. And it makes me wonder, what will her legacy be? How will history look back on her time on the court?
Yeah.
How will they judge her impact on American law? That's a big question, and one that we're probably all going to be thinking about for a long time.
It's a question that, only time can really answer. But one thing's for sure, Amy Coney Barrett, she's someone we need to be paying attention to. Her decisions, they're going to keep shaping the legal landscape for generations. And this deep dive, looking at her life, the things that influenced her, what kind of impact she might have, all that stuff, it's giving you the knowledge you need to really understand her role in all of this.
I think that's a great way to put it. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. To our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this journey of discovery. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep engaging with, all the complexities of American law. Because in the end, the future of our legal system, well, it's shaped by informed citizens like you.